Once again, I welcome you to another exciting chapter summary of the Great Controversy. In today's chapter, we will look at Liberty of Conscience Threatened. Ellen White starts this chapter writing, Protestants today regard Romanism with more favor than they did years ago. Among Protestants, the opinion is gaining ground that after all, on vital points, the divergences are not so great as was supposed, and that a few small concessions on their part would put them in better intelligence with Rome. These statements were written a long time ago. Today, there are many who maintain that it is unfair to judge the church of our day by their errors, abominations, and abuses of the past. Could it be that the claim of infallibility sustained for 800 years is a thing of the past? Rome assures that the church never erred, nor will it ever err. The Catholic Church will never abandon its claim to infallibility. And Ellen White writes in a language that may be striking to us today. Repeal the restrictive measures now imposed by civil governments and let Rome regain her ancient power, and you will see her tyranny and persecutions revived on the spot. Before continuing with this audio, it is important to highlight what the author of the Great Controversy writes. There are true Christians in the Roman Catholic Church. They serve God to the best of their ability and do it wholeheartedly. She does not speak of fervent and sincere Catholics, but of Romanism as a system that is currently no more in harmony with the gospel of Christ than at any other period in its history. Today in the Protestant churches, many are those who attribute to fanaticism or clarity any fears expressed about Roman Catholicism in the United States. But the Roman Church has not changed. It is a categorical and striking statement, but it needs to be heard. Rome continues to extend its influence and to increase its power. Its churches and chapels are increasing in Protestant countries. Its colleges are increasing in popularity in the United States. There's a dangerous tendency to lose sight of the true character of Romanism, and hence the importance of reading this chapter carefully. It is often assumed that the Catholic religion is unattractive and that its worship is a series of dry and meaningless ceremonies. But they're wrong. Ellen White speaks of the Catholic worship and its ceremonies that deeply impress. She also speaks of the beauty of their art, of their processions, of the imposing churches and altars that are the object of admiration all over the world. Their music is unparalleled, and the splendor and pomp of their ceremonies exert a seductive, fascinating power that deceives many people and prevents them from seeing the purity, simplicity, and beauty of the true gospel. God offers a transforming and powerful experience. The world admires an apparent religious experience, fascinating but lacking in power. A church that claims to have the right to forgive sins through confession degrades the human being. Instead of going to God, the confessor goes to the priest who plays the role of God's representative. Ellen White affirms, for anyone who likes to indulge his evil tendencies, it is easier to confess to a poor mortal than to open his soul to God. It is more pleasing to human nature to do penance than to renounce sin. It is easier to mortify the flesh by wearing sackcloth, nettles, and rending chains than to renounce carnal desires. The Catholic Church places the cross in its churches, on its altars, and the symbols of Christ's suffering is revered. But unfortunately, the teachings of Christ are buried under a heap of absurd traditions, false interpretations, and rigorous burdens. Conscientious souls are left a constant prey to terror, fearing the wrath of an offended God. Images and relics are worshipped. Saints are invoked, and the figure of the Pope is exalted, leading people away from God and the work of His Son on behalf of humanity. There's a clear and systematic effort to distract people's attention from the one who alone can assure them salvation. We speak of a church that, in its time of supremacy, used instruments of torture to force men to accept its doctrines. Horrible massacres occurred in history against those who did not want to yield to its teachings. The adversaries of Rome were victims of torture machines that were devised by the dignitaries of what called itself the Church of God. Cruel was the dominion of this gigantic system of deception in the very heart of Christianity. The Catholic Church at present puts on a mild face to the world and presents apologies for her horrible cruelties. It has put on Christ-like garments, but in reality it has not changed. All the principles formulated by Popery in former ages subsist in our own day. The doctrines invented in the darkest centuries are still professed. Let no one be deceived. The papacy which Protestants are now so ready to honor is the same that ruled the world at the time of the Reformation, when men of God arose at the peril of their lives to denounce the iniquity of it. Faced with such a reality, Ellen White asks, can it be possible that this power, whose history was written for 1,000 years with the blood of the saints, is not recognized as part of the Church of Christ? Today, the Protestant churches are closer to Catholicism. A change has been verified, but it's not the papacy that has changed. Apologies are made to Rome for having judged it so uncharitably, believing that it was the spiritual and moral darkness of the Middle Ages that favored Rome's superstitious and persecuting attitudes. It is believed that we could never live again the intolerance and tyranny of the past because we live in a century where intellectual, moral, and religious light shines. It is true that today there's more light than in the past. But it is also true that where there's more light, the darkness is denser when the light is rejected. The truth shown in the Bible cannot be changed. The true character of this religious system is manifest in its pages. There are those who prefer to be left behind by the majority because it's more comfortable. But just because it's more comfortable doesn't mean it's right. Those who want to be saved by their merits and those who want to be saved in their sins are united in a religious formalism that numbs the consciences. Without any biblical basis for it, Protestant churches defend the idea of venerating Sunday as a holy day. Without realizing it, they're following in the footsteps of the papacy. Prophecy warns that this attitude will allow the papacy to regain the supremacy it lost in the old world. The papacy sees in the sanctity of Sunday a sign of its authority, and the Protestant churches are collaborating in exalting this day as Catholicism did in the past. Human tradition, however ancient it may be, cannot override God's commandment. Ellen White devotes a large portion of this chapter to recall the history of this fateful change. Century after century, the authority of the church did everything possible to transfer the sanctity of the biblical Sabbath to Sunday. Thus, in the 16th century, a papal council explicitly ordered that all Christians remember that the seventh day was consecrated by God and accepted and observed not only by the Jews, but also by all those who wanted to worship God. Nevertheless, we Christians have changed their Sabbath into the Lord's Day, Sunday. Remembering how Christians were forced to obey a human command is important, because the Word of God teaches us that these scenes are to be repeated when Roman Catholics and Protestants unite to exalt Sunday. Bible prophecy states that the power represented by the lamb-horned beast will cause the inhabitants of earth to worship the first beast presented in Revelation chapter 13. This important theme announces that sooner or later, a mark will be imposed that will declare the authority of the power that proclaims to have the right to change the divine law. As we have already seen in our previous chapter, it has been demonstrated that the United States of America is the power represented by the beast with two horns like a lamb, and that this prophecy will be fulfilled when the United States makes the observance of Sunday, which Rome declares to be the characteristic sign of her supremacy. Paul affirms that the man of sin will subsist until the second coming. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 8. The work of deception will come to the end of time, and the whole earth will be seen to be a man of sin. The biblical warnings presented to us in this chapter are disconcerting, but as believers we should take the biblical exhortations seriously. Ellen White states, "The cleverness and cunning of the Roman Church is astonishing. It can read the future. She takes time to see that the Protestant churches are paying homage to her by the acceptance of the false Sabbath, and are preparing to enforce it by the same means she has employed in former times. Those who reject the light of truth will still seek the aid of this self-styled infallible power in order to exalt an institution which owes its origin to Rome. It is not difficult to foresee how quickly she will come to the aid of the Protestants in this movement. Let's not forget that Rome boasts of never changing. Little do Protestants know what they're doing in proposing to accept Rome's help in the task of exalting Sunday. It may be that the reasons they present for finding a common day of worship are good, and that the union of all Christians is seen as a positive symbol in this complicated world. But the Bible warns that the purpose of this apparent unity is to grant authority to the church that understands that it should never have lost such power. This is how Ellen White ends this exciting chapter. Rome is secretly increasing her power. Her doctrines are exerting their influence in the legislative houses, in the churches, and in the hearts of men. The Word of God has given warnings in regard to such impending danger. Neglect these warnings, and the Protestant world will know what Rome's real purposes are. But it will be too late to get out of this snare. All that Rome desires is to secure some advantage, and this has already been granted to her. We shall soon see and feel the purposes of Romanism. Anyone who believes or obeys the Word of God will incur reproach and persecution. Dear friends, in the face of this latent and real threat to freedom of conscience, we must ask God to help us to remain always faithful to His Word.